the orthoPAC, hosted by Sam Dyer. Welcome to the orthoPAC, where we discuss up-to-date orthopedic topics for the busy clinician. I invite you to sit back and relax as I attempt to fill in the gaps between education, current events, and real-world practice.
Welcome back, listeners. My name's Chuck Dowell, filling in for Sam today as the guest host for this episode. Very excited to introduce Dr. Randon Hall. Dr. Hall is a primary care sports medicine specialist working at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Dr. Hall recently gave a presentation on the practical approach to nutrition and adolescence at our PAOS Ortho West conference. Welcome to the episode, Dr. Hall.
Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be back, and thanks for inviting me back.
I found your presentation very interesting. It was a great presentation. You talked about the importance of nutrition in athletes. Can you just kind of briefly give us some of those general recommendations and your concept of energy balance?
I think what's helpful is just my overall approach is that kids spend so much time, intense practice, intense weight training, speed coaches, video review, and I think they just do not spend enough time thinking about how they need to do nutrition, how they need to do recovery. And so that's really where the impetus for this talk comes from, and just keeping it very practical. And I've worked with some individual athletes on the side, and the biggest things that I see is they really have no plan of action. So you're playing a sport and you don't have any plays or any specific plan when you go out on the field. And I feel like that's the same way for a lot of these young athletes. Similarly, within that plan, what I usually see is most of the time kids do not eat enough food. So as far as energy balance goes, and not even getting into the individual macromolecules, but you just count up, hey, take me from when you wake up to when you go to sleep. And then what ends up happening is you're just way underfueled for your ability to be able to perform. And I think that plays a big role in terms of being able to maximize your performance or optimize it at least. And that's the biggest thing that I see, is just simply getting enough calories in. And then I think as far as kind of fluids go, it's very similar, that if you're 1, 2, 3% dehydrated, that's dramatically going to affect your performance. But a lot of times athletes don't have a plan when they get to the field. They don't have a system by which they use to prepare. And so those are kind of the overarching thoughts that I usually approach families or kids with, to focus on, hey, this isn't calculus. This really isn't a complicated issue. It is simply looking at how much you sweat, how much you burn when you're working out, and making sure that the nutritional content of what you eat is equivalent or a little bit more in order to have enough energy to get through a practice or a day at your highest level of competition.
Yeah, I always found it interesting. I know when I was playing high school and college sports, I spent so much time in the gym kind of getting stronger and so much time practicing basketball, but very little time on nutrition. So I think it's an important concept to get across to the kids. I always remember we used to have the spaghetti meals as the pregame meal beforehand, as our kind of carb-loading meal. And that was one of the things you mentioned during your presentation, kind of the importance of carbs and the importance of timing of carbs and how our body uses carbs as fuel. I was wondering if you could maybe just, again, briefly go over that for the listeners so they can make some general recommendations regarding pregame, intragame, the golden hour afterwards, and kind of how your body uses carbs depending on the timing of the sport or the length of the sport, let's say.
Yeah, and I can go into that. I'll try to keep the answer not too long, but the concept here is that your body using fuel during exercise is primarily carbohydrate. Some fat is used depending on what level of intensity you're working out, but very little, if any, protein is being used for the fuel to do the job that you're trying to do on the court, on the field, wherever you are. And so I think simply understanding that the fuel that goes in the tank that's used to push the car forward is carbohydrate. And that's what you want to maximize for whatever sport that you're participating in. Now, it makes a bigger difference if it's a sport that's, a much longer sport. So for example, if you're doing a sprint, maybe that's not going to be that critical. But let's talk about, a basketball game, a soccer game. We do like the pregame carbohydrate meal, but the point there is that really needs to start 2, 3, 4 days prior to your competition. And so if you're going hard in the gym and you're going hard at practice, you keep burning down that tank of fuel, that tank of carbohydrate, so that it needs to be replenished each day. And so what I suggest is about 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. That's what we consider carbo-loading. And so if you're doing that on a daily basis, and I like to use football as an example just because there's a longer time period in between each of the games. If your game is on a Friday, you're really wanting to start that carbo-loading on a Wednesday or a Tuesday to build up your stores. There is a thought that if you can build up your stores over a 2 to 3 day period, and then you taper down your intensity over that same time frame. So let's say, Wednesday is a light practice with Thursday some film and review, then you're taking down your intensity and increasing your carbohydrate intake. That is really going to jam-pack your fuel tank, or to jam-pack your stores in order to be able to participate at your highest level of performance. The reason why that matters is during performance, you are pulling from that tank of carbohydrate to be able to do all the things you need to do on the field. Once that tank gets emptied, you can't perform at a high level of intensity. It's physically impossible. Your body starts to rely on fat, and fat is a very inefficient fuel source by which to do sports, and you have to slow down. Your intensity has to decrease. So that's what we like to focus on prior to game. And yes, pregame meal is great, but a few days beforehand is even better. And then we also like to think about in-game carbohydrate intake. And the key there is that the rate limiting step is how much your body can absorb at a time. So yes, you could have a big pasta meal at halftime, which I wouldn't advise, but you could do that. And the body only absorbs 60 grams of carb an hour. So each minute is a gram of carb. So what you're doing is trying to trickle that in throughout your game or throughout your practice so that you're not depleting your fuel of carbohydrate. And that's where some of these sports drinks come in, and not that anybody has to take a sports drink, but the way it's calculated out is basically if you are drinking that sports drink, you're getting the right amount of fluid as well as you're getting the right amount of carbohydrates trickled in over, let's say, an hour's time, and that'll help get that tank replenished during the game. What I tell people is simple things like that's where the little kids are the oranges at halftime. You'll see some sports teams doing like gummy bears. You don't have to buy the more expensive name brand chews and things, but you can just get small carbohydrate snacks, pretzels, goos, gels, all of those things. The purpose in mind there is small amount of carb that can be absorbed so that you don't have this big carbohydrate load sitting in your stomach while you're trying to play, and you trickle that in throughout competition. So that hits the pregame, that hits the in-game. And then it does matter because your body usually uses the carbohydrate it has stored in about 60 to 90 minutes. So you don't necessarily have to be doing carb in-game, but if your game has the potential to go longer than 60 minutes or your practice does, then you want to plan ahead, because if it gets to overtime, it's kind of too late to try to quickly get in carbohydrate and keep your intensity high. And that's why I tell people just to plan ahead, have a little system by which you take first quarter, halftime, third quarter type of plan, just in case the game does go longer than what you anticipate. And then the golden hour is really most important for someone who has multiple sessions in a day or back-to-back games. So, for example, what happens is the body is just a beautiful machine that understands, okay, I need to replenish this carbohydrate as quickly as possible in order to be prepared for my next bout of exercise. Well, if your next bout of exercise is 4 days later, then it doesn't really matter too much to take advantage of the golden hour. But what it does is it says, okay, when you take carbohydrate, I'm going to be able to more effectively store that carbohydrate as glycogen through a number of processes. And that all happens within the first 1 to 2 hours after you deplete your stores. And so if you know, hey, I have a tournament and I have a game in 3 hours or 4 hours, it's really important to take advantage of that golden hour in order to replenish your stores as efficiently as possible prior to the next bout of competition. And so usually, if it's football, not a big deal. You don't have a game until next Friday. But if it's basketball and you have 3-4 games a week, it really is important to do that because you don't necessarily have those 2 or 3 days beforehand to really build up your carbohydrate store. And so that's why it's really important to take advantage of that golden hour when you're talking about multiple sessions in a day and multiple games per week.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, that applies to those kind of AAU players or those basketball, volleyball tournaments on the weekend who are playing, 3-4 games over the weekend, when you're going to get gradually fatigued throughout the day. And I think replenishing those carb stores is very important. You had mentioned, which is a great idea, keeping a little kit in your car of those fast acting applesauces that I have for my kids, and just quick carbs that you could take that are easy to absorb, but to replenish that either intra or after the game. I think one of the worst feelings in the world is being in the game and kind of hitting that bonk, feeling like you're completely fatigued and your body's exhausted all of its carbs and you don't have any energy to continue participating, or at least at the level that you want to participate. So I think those are all great recommendations.
Yeah, that's precisely it. When you're, especially running is a good example, is, when you have to slow your pace down, you're burning fat, not really carbohydrate. And you just can't go any harder, even if you will yourself to do so.
Join us next week for more with Dr. Hall regarding sports nutrition.
We also welcome you to visit our website, paos.org, where members can download virtual conference content and get Category 1 CME. Also, if you're a non-member, please visit the aapa.org Learning Central for the PAOS virtual content.